Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Tongle Si will defend the academic thesis entitled Regulation and Implementation of Public-Private Partnerships, a comparative analysis of public-private partnerships in the legal regimes of China and the European Union. Dear candidate, may I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Esteemed co-rector, esteemed members of the committee, dear family, friends, and colleagues, let's start. Public-private partnerships are arrangements in which the private sector participates in public works and services that are traditionally provided by the public sector. In such partnerships, usually the public sector is responsible for providing administrative support, organizing competitive bidding procedures to select the private sector, and monitoring the private sector's activities. The private sector provides most of the project financing and takes the responsibility of project operation. This division of responsibilities is expected to combine the strengths of the public and private sectors. Public-private partnerships are often used in large and international infrastructure projects such as water supply, wastewater treatment, solid waste management, and other areas such as public health and telecommunications. Some well-known international infrastructure projects are Beijing Olympic Stadium, also known as the Bird's Nest, Second Severn Crossing Bridge connecting England and Wales, the Channel Tunnel connecting UK and France, and also the XL test lanes, which help the Dutch government increase the test capacity during the COVID-19 pandemic. Adopting PPPs can improve the operational efficiency of these infrastructure projects, which can bring us citizens more convenience. However, in practice, these projects face various legal risks, which may undermine the expected results of this project. Many situations may cause legal risks, such as unclear applicable regulations, the change of regulations, and the unclear regulations. As legal risks accumulate, the efficiency of projects will start to decline, and the total project cost will start to rise. In order to mitigate the legal risk which is caused by unfamiliarity of the regulatory status of PPPs in the project host country or countries, this research selects China and the EU to compare how PPPs are regulated and implemented in these jurisdictions. The aim of this research is to bridge their understandings of PPPs and also provide legal guidance for private actors from China and the EU to participate in PPP projects in each other's market. To achieve this goal, the core research question of this research is designed as following. What are the similarities and differences in how China and the EU regulate and implement PPPs to facilitate their effective use in infrastructure projects? To answer this core research question, this research further designs 3 sub-questions to compare the theoretical frameworks to regulate PPPs, the PPP regulatory frameworks, and PPP implementation processes in China and the EU. This comparative research does not only provide a comprehensive analysis of PPPs in China and the EU, but also help target deficiencies in their PPP regulation and implementation. The first conclusion is that theoretical frameworks to regulate PPPs, PPP regulatory frameworks, and PPP implementation processes in China and the EU are comparable in both structure and content. Even if the political, economic, and legal systems differ, China and the EU share many similarities in the comparison points, but there are also some differences in the design of specific provisions. There are 3 points to extend to this conclusion. Firstly, in establishing the theoretical frameworks to regulate PPPs, both China and the EU provide similar definitions of PPPs, which cover all internationally recognized characteristics of PPPs, including long-term duration for the public interest, involvement of various participants, extensive responsibilities and risks allocated to the private sector, and also performance-linked remuneration. Differences mainly concern the specific regulation of these characteristics. For example, when it comes to regulating the duration of a PPP project, China legalized that a PPP project should cover from 10 to 30 years. In this aspect, the EU only provides guidance with soft law instrument and leaves discretion to member states. In the Netherlands, the duration of a PPP project fixed from 20 to 30 years. Secondly, in establishing the PPP regulatory framework, as both China and the EU classify PPPs within the broad scope of public procurement, their current PPP regulatory frameworks are mainly established on the public procurement regulations, together with political documents and guidance specific to PPPs. Moreover, China and the EU are committed to passing PPP-specific regulations with different approaches. In China, the central government is trying to release a PPP regulation, which can unify all PPP-specific administrative rules and also generally applied to all PPP projects carried out within the territory of China. However, this draft regulation failed to come into force as planned in the beginning of 2019. In the EU, in 2014, the lawmaker passed a directive on the award of concession contracts. As concessions are the most widely used model of PPPs, the release of this directive is regarded as an innovative step in the EU to regulate PPPs. Thirdly, in PPP implementation, both China and the EU recognize the implementation process should cover the whole life cycle of a PPP project. After comparing 5 essential steps, this research found that although the names of these steps are different, they are quite similar in practical application. For example, the step in which the public and private sectors can initiate potential PPP projects, it is called project initiation in China, but project selection and definition in the EU. The second conclusion of this research is that the PPP regulation and implementation in the EU appear to have more potential to promote effective use of PPPs. As I have mentioned, the EU revised its 2004 Public Procurement Directive package in 2014. And for the first time, it includes the directive on award of concession contracts. In this revised package, there are several innovative provisions that are PPP-friendly. For example, in the design of procurement procedures, it gives public authority more flexibilities to negotiate with the private party during the procurement, which is specifically interesting and important in complicated PPP projects. Moreover, the EU Concession Directive clearly explains one fundamental risk, the operational risk. This directive further clarifies that the private party in PPPs in concessions should take the operational risk. As we have mentioned in the beginning, in PPPs, usually the private sector takes the responsibility of operation. A clear provision of the operational risk allocation will provide more legal certainty to public and private sectors participates in concession contracts. In China, the current PPP regulatory framework is fragmented. The government procurement law and the bidding law cannot fully meet the legal requirements of PPP project implementation due to the different project financing arrangement and also the limited applicable situations. What is worse, as some essential PPP-specific administrative rules have expired, PPP projects in China are facing a situation where there is no effective regulations to follow. To facilitate China and the EU to improve their PPP regulation and implementation, this research ends with recommendations to China and the EU, specifically in their future possible PPP cooperations. My recommendation concerning China are the following. China should prioritize the release of the PPP regulation, which can coordinate the applications of public procurement law and bidding law and also fill the regulatory gap of PPPs. In my opinion, when revising this regulation, Chinese lawmakers can refer to EU's 2014 Procurement Directive package to find some inspirations. And my recommendations concerning the EU is that more efforts can be made to evaluate the application, implementation, and effectiveness of the 2014 Procurement Directive package when applied to PPPs. In particular, the practical effectiveness of the concession directives should be evaluated. As for promoting PPP cooperation between China and the EU in the future, this research recommends that the EU could consider to ratify the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement of Investment, which can further remove restrictions on investors to enter each other's market. Or China can also speed up joining the Government Procurement Agreement, to which the EU is already a member. If both China and the EU are members of GPA, they can use this international agreement as legal basis for their future cooperations in PPP projects. Thank you for your attention. Now I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Faure. Professor Faure is Professor of Comparative and International Environmental Law at our university, and he is also the chair of the Assessment Committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rector. Dear candidate, I have followed your work during many years. You were a loyal participant in the training program of the Jus Commune Research School, and I am very happy to see the final result of your impressive work. It is for the first time, as you just have sketched, that we get a detailed overview of public-private partnerships, both in the EU as well as in China. Congratulations. The question I would like to ask you is probably a politically not so correct one. You describe, as far as China is concerned, in a detailed manner how public-private partnerships take place today, that there is some regulation, but in fact not a lot, and that there is a draft regulation which is not yet enacted. On the question whether we need regulation for public-private partnerships to take place, other colleagues will undoubtedly still question you. But the aspect I would like to discuss with you is the following. You look at the situation in the EU and China, inter alia examining whether China can learn from Europe. You provide nice descriptions of how the current institutional framework works, but you make implicitly one very strong assumption in this description, being that all the partners in this framework are working in the public interest. In other words, that the public-private partnerships are concluded to increase social welfare in economic terms. Now, and here comes the politically incorrect statement. We all know, and it doesn't come from me, but inter alia from NGOs, like Transparency International, that the rule of law and public participation, as well as access to justice, to put it mildly, still are a major issue in your beautiful country. And that in some domains, there is a high degree of what Anthony Ogus calls opportunistic behavior. In other words, collusion and corruption. My simple question to you is how that affects the appetite for public-private partnerships. And if you would assume that there may be collusion, you could, for example, think of projects being allocated to one particular operator that bribed a civil servant, or projects taking much longer and more money as a result of bribery. How exactly would that affect your analysis? See, following is what interests me. Would you argue that the involvement of the private sector is something beneficial, as it could reduce inefficiencies resulting from infrastructure projects generated by the state alone? Or would you argue to the contrary, that collusion could also affect the value and quality of infrastructure projects executed by private partners, and that in fact PPPs may be an ideal mechanism to reward corrupt bureaucrats? So how does corruption relate to PPPs? Now, as China is undoubtedly listening online, I am very much looking forward to see how you will act strategically to answer my politically incorrect question, Mrs. Candidate.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words of my thesis, and also thank you for your questions. And I think corruption is not only a problem to PPPs, it will undermine the effect, the results of any kind of project. And there are some measures also taken to fight against this kind of corruptions. And if you ask how corruption influences the PPPs, I can say that in PPP project, if we initiate a PPP project, both the private and public sectors can initiate potential PPP projects. How corruption will influence this initiation is that if there is bribery and also corruption, maybe the government, the public sector, will have the political bias to give undue advantage to certain economic operators and also certain projects. So yes, corruption can undermine the effect of PPP projects. But in my research, as this research does not do a lot about corruption, I think PPP is still an effective way to fight against corruption, and also as in PPPs, the public sector will impose administrative measures to supervise the project, and also the private sector will also prove it can do this, and also the general public can also impose some supervision influence on this project. So in my view, I think PPP do have some potential to fight against corruption. Yes, indeed, in the future PPP regulation, draft design revision, both governments in China and the EU should think about these corruption issues and about the transparency. Am I correct? You also asked the transparency issues in PPPs. Yes, the transparency. China and the EU are also doing some works to deal with these transparency principles, like in China, the Ministry of Finance and also the National Reform and Development Commission. They have some database or platform. You can have the general public can also get access to the information of these projects, which can increase the transparency of these projects. But yes, indeed, the transparency issue is often accused by the EU investors in Chinese market to say, okay, the regulation is not clear, and also the information of the procurement procedures not clear. This is the reason why I do this research, to provide more values and provide more information to deal with these transparency issues. Hope this answers your
Thank you for your clarifying answer, Mrs. Candidate.
The opposition will now be continued by Professor Caranta. Professor Caranta is Professor of Public Law at the University of Torino, and he is also a member of the Assessment Committee. He is joining us online for this ceremony, and I would like to welcome him very much to Maastricht University today. Very good to have you here with us. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, dear colleagues. First thing I must say is apologies. Apologies especially to Ms. Tongle for being present only online to her defense. I must say that I have really very much appreciated your work and the way you managed to react constructively to the many remarks that we made on your first draft. I'm fully aware of the difficulties in comparing EU and China. There are some peculiarities to the EU. The EU is not a centralized state. There is this division of competencies between EU level and member states level. EU is regulating, but not regulating all aspects. Member states are regulating and implementing projects. And of course, well, I come from a country where unfortunately corruption is a big problem. But I don't want to go into this. My question is a little bit more on your proposition 6. And what you write is totally sensible. One effective regulation should cover the whole life cycle of the PPP project implementation. But let's say what is sensible is often for philosophers, at times economists, not always, I'm afraid, for lawyers. My question is, how could EU law regulate all the cycle of the PPP, including the implementation phase? Is there a legal base for legislation, hard law in this area? Thank you very much for really this beautiful, interesting work you have drafted, please.
highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words of my thesis, and also thank you very much for your question about the proposition 6.
One effective regulation should cover the whole life cycle of the PPP project implementation.
I think if I understand correctly, you asked the question, how could EU law cover the whole life cycle of a PPP project? And is it possible to have a hard EU law on these regulations? And if I give a quick answer to that, I don't think there is any room for a hard law on this issue. But if we define law, in my thesis, I divide the law on the EU level into hard law and soft law. And most guidance of how to implement a PPP project is written in the soft law. And I think this is already quite effective to, let's say, regulate PPPs. I can explain why. In the soft law, it gives very detailed explanation of PPPs and the explanation of every stage in PPP implementation process. And for important issues, such as whether we need to regulate PPP and to what degree the EU should regulate PPP, the Commission already pay attention to these issues. And it will think, okay, whether we should have a directive or regulation on this, like the directive on concession, on the award of concession contracts. It is based on the questions from questionnaires and the discussion between the EU and also member states to say, okay, the member states may need some regulations on the EU level on this aspect. Then it comes into this directive, and the EU can also choose the way and the degree to regulate. I don't think there is any room for a hard law on the whole life cycle of PPP implementation, because the member states, the whole life cycle of PPP, it involves quite a lot of the administrative frameworks in member states, and the government organization, and also the financial issues of the government, how the government should use its physical finance, a lot of issues. So I think the EU doesn't have the competence to regulate this. They cannot just tell the Italian government, okay, you should do this with how many money from your budget. That is already beyond the EU competence. So my quick question for this is that in the EU, no hard law, no room for hard law. But I still think the EU is already do a good job to the hard law on the EU, let's say the directive on procurement directives, even though they are not covering, in my thesis, I see that even though they are not covering the whole life cycle of PPPs, they pay attention to important issues, like the operational issue. In PPPs, operation responsibility is the most important part, right? The construction after the construction, it is the private party to operate the asset and provide public services to the public. It often lasts for more than 10 years. So operation is the most important, and the EU directive pay attention to this important issue. Let's say, okay, the EU directives is like a cherry picking. It is only cover the most important part. It is already an effective measure to regulate PPPs. And this proposal does not only go to the EU. It is said that, okay, in the member states and also in China, with a country, if you want to regulate PPPs effectively, the government may think to release a uniform law to covering the whole life cycle of PPPs. Like in Italy, it can think about to release a PPP law which covering the project initiation, project construction, operation, and also the project maintenance. This is also possible in China, but on the EU level, no room for the hard law. Thank you. Hope this answers your question.
Yes, really spot on answer. Thank you, Ms. Tongle. floor is back to you.
The opposition will now be continued by Professor Zhou. Professor Zhou is Dean and Professor of the Chinese Academy of PPP Governance at the Central University of Finance and Economics in Beijing, and he is also a member of the Assessment Committee. Professor Zhou is also joining us online for this ceremony, and I would also like to welcome him very much to Maastricht University today. Wonderful to have you here with us.
Hello, dear Mr. Chair, dear colleagues there, and dear Ms. Candidate. And again, greetings from Beijing for a happy new year of rabbit. And also my sincere congratulations to Ms. Candidate for the accomplishment and in this the wonderful research work, which covers, broad issues and timing issues and interesting issues of PPPs. And I believe EU and China are among the, largest PPP market in the world. And the regulations of this new issue of PPPs has been a long time, but in the most recent decade, apparently it has been very, very active. So congratulations again. In fact, when I read through the research work, and I have many questions which I would like to discuss with the candidate and possibly the colleagues, very interesting, very critical issues in PP regulations, I believe, both in EU and China. And but for the limited time, this candidate would like to choose one of them to answer. The first one is the incorporation of sustainability into the PPP project, especially in the procurement cycle, the whole life procurement cycle, including the initiation of the PP project. For example, the value for money assessment, the comparative value for money assessment, and sustainable considerations in the procurement stages, for example. And question number two is a very interesting issue of codification of PPP legislation. The EU seems to me has regulated concession in a separate directive, but for the government procurement type of PPP, the EU choose to incorporate that into the public sector directive. But the most recent development in China seems, for example, the Chinese government procurement law seem to, regulate both the government paid PPP project, PPP, and the concession side of PPP. So the question is that how to incorporate the, different modality PPP into the procurement law. It sounds like in one code, put, the critical issues of PPP into, one single uniformed procurement law code, which is very challenging, right? I'm also wonder whether the candidate is aware of, the experience and the practice, in the EU member, level. Any particular country, at the EU level, they have a number of laws governing different aspects of PPP. But in the EU number, there is an appearance that they codify all the aspects of PPP procurement, including concession type of PPP, government paid PPP, into one single uniform law. So very interesting, right? We see the it is evolving, such as the regulatory modalities or varied modalities are evolving very interestingly. And third is EU-China collaboration. And the candidate during the in the thesis and also during the short presentation just now, I mentioned that the EU-China investment agreement, also the proposed GBA session of China, are two good forums, for further the EU and China future collaboration, especially in the procurement and PPP market. The question is that are there any concrete, the deeper rationales and concrete recommendations in this regard? So I have a number of questions. The candidate would like to choose one or two of them due to the time limit. Thank you very much.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words of my thesis, and thank you very much for your questions. If I understand correctly, you raised 3 questions. One is that the consideration of sustainable development in PPPs, correct? Yeah, and the second one is what is the challenge? And second one is what is the challenge to incorporate the regulations of PPPs into the government procurement law revision? And the third is that what is my concrete recommendations for future cooperation? Okay, thank you for the first question. Actually, both China and the EU have already considered the sustainable development in public procurement and also PPPs, like especially in the EU, like in the Directive 2014 Procurement Directive. In the recital, it emphasized that when the public authority start the procurement activities, it should consider the sustainability. What I want to emphasize here is that sustainable development has 3 pillars: social, economic, and environment. We cannot only emphasize one sustainable development, the environment. When applying PPPs, when applying the whole life circle of PPPs, we should consider both 3 pillars. We should also respect the social sustainability and economic sustainability and also environmental sustainabilities. And I think yes, in the future, China and the EU, when they design or revise or update the whole life circle of PPPs, they should take both considerations. And for the second question, what is the challenge when we include the PPP regulation in the revision of public procurement law in China? I think there are many challenges. First, we must think the differences between public procurement and PPPs. They have a lot of differences. For example, the financial arrangement in public procurement, the money paid for the goods, services, and works are from the public budget. But for the EU, the initial investment are arranged by the private sector. So how to deal with this issue should be the first challenge the lawmakers should consider. And also we should mention that there are some procurement procedures in public procurement cannot be applied to PPPs in Chinese law. For example, the single source procurement procedure and also the price inquiry, which lack competitive factors in these procedures. They can also not apply to PPPs. And also the public procurement procedure, if we want to revise it, it's better to cover the whole life circle of PPPs. But it is not possible. Yeah, it is not possible. The public procurement law is more like telling the government how to use their money from the taxpayers more efficiently, more effectively. But PPPs, it requires more. It requires the public and sectors how to organize their partnerships effectively. So I think the rationale of these rules of these regulations are quite different. So my opinion in my thesis is that we should have a separate PPP regulation. It is below in the hierarchy of legislation. It's below the law. So it is in consistence with it is in line with the regulations of public procurement law. It will not contradict. And the separate regulation on PPPs can coordinate the application of public procurement law and the PPPs very, very well. And the procurement of PPPs can use the principles and also the procurement procedures in public procurement law. So my suggestion is that when revising Chinese government procurement law, we can mention, maybe use 1 or 2 provisions that, okay, in PPPs, like the open procedures, restricted procedures, recommended to procure PPP projects. But I still insist we should have a separate administrative regulation, which is below the level of law, to specific on PPPs, to cover the whole life cycle of PPP projects. That is, for me, I think this is the more effective way to regulate PPPs. Considering the number of Chinese PPP projects is really large, almost 10,000, I think it's better, and it's better to have a separate regulation. And for your third question,
thank you so much for taking out this one question. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Philipsen. Professor Philipsen is Professor of Shifts in Private and Public Regulation at Erasmus University of Rotterdam and Professor of Law here at our university. He's also a member of the Assessment Committee. And I give him the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, dear Tongle, let me first join my colleagues in praising your detailed manuscript, 460 pages of comparison and legal details. I particularly liked the extensive summary tables at the end, which are very insightful. But I'll now jump to the question also for reasons of time. And my question today is on the concept of effectiveness that you use. I know that you could not do a law and economics analysis. You chose not to do it. You sometimes use the term efficiency, but I will not question you on this. But effectiveness is also interesting. It can, in theory, mean several things, right? It's often defined as problem-solving effectiveness. That seems to be your focus. But there's also something like behavioral effectiveness, like do the legal rules change the behavior in the way we want it? But I guess you are focused more on the problem-solving part. So what I first want to do is to read a short passage from your book, page 28, where you basically introduce the reader to your use of the concept, right? So you say, the criteria for an effective PPP regulation established in this thesis are neither comprehensive nor the only standard, nor does this thesis provide a model law for PPPs. The criteria for effective PPP regulation in this thesis are derived from the purpose for which PPPs are adopted. Rather than adopting economic and legal theory, this thesis takes a practical approach to examining whether the regulation meets the goals of PPP adoption, maximizing PPP benefits and minimizing its disadvantages. And then you extend on that in chapter 2 nicely with the tables, the figures, where you talk about the ways to reduce the disadvantages and to maximize the benefits. Okay, but still that leaves me a bit wondering, okay, so what are now really the factors we should focus on when we read effectiveness in your thesis or effective regulation? Does it mean more use of PPPs? Well, I guess it's not that. You say that's not necessarily what we want. It's not even what the legislator seems to want, because there are these financial thresholds, the 10% and all of that in China. Does it then mean better use? I guess yes, that then would be in line with this problem-solving effectiveness definition. But then what is a better use? And then you give a couple of suggestions in the thesis. There's minimizing the risk of project failure. Yes, there's so reduction of risks, and PPP regulation can help do that. Legal certainty, which you stressed also today, and maybe public interest, which you also put in the table, but it can be interpreted in many ways. Maybe better cooperation between China and the EU. So there's a lot of things that can make parties better use PPPs, right? So my question is then still, do we always need law to regulate that? Reduction of risks? Yeah, not so certain we need the law for that. Legal certainty, yeah, perhaps yes, but do we need more law for that? Not necessarily. So in the essence, my question is, can you summarize maybe in a few sentences what for you are the most important factors in judging the effectiveness of PPP regulation? And then I just want to check if my suggestions are a bit in the right direction or whether I missed something. I leave it at that. Thank you for your reply in advance.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words on my thesis, and also thank you very much for your question. And in my thesis, I do pay attention to some factors to increase the effectiveness. As you have mentioned, yes, in my thesis, I pay attention to the better use of PPPs because I think a better use of PPPs can increase the social welfare, which is also an aspect of the increase the efficiency. Some factors of effectiveness is that influence the effectiveness of PPP is that we should pay attention to the intention of both public and sectors joining PPPs, like when we regulating PPPs to have the effectiveness of PPPs, we should respect the profit-making pursuit of the private sector. And also, factors for effectiveness is to consider the protection of the public interest. In short, if we want to achieve effectiveness, we should pay attention to all three P's in PPPs: the public sector, private sector, and also their partnership, also the partnerships, and also the public interest. And more factors influence the effectiveness is that we should also pay attention to the characteristics of PPPs. In my research, I explain a lot when establishing the frameworks to assess the effectiveness of the PPP regulatory framework. We should pay more attention to the characteristics of PPPs when we regulate to use PPPs to realize effectiveness. Thank you. Hope this answers your question, even though it is very short.
I will accept this answer, yes. Thank you.
In that case, the opposition will be continued by Professor van Garse. Professor van Garse is Professor of Public and Administrative Law at the Universities of Hasselt and Antwerpen. And I would like to welcome him also very much to our university here today.
Thank you, Mr. Rector. First of all, thank you for inviting me as an external member. It's a privilege and an honor to be here. And I think this topic is of great interest. For many years, I was in charge of the Belgian PPP projects as director of the PPP Center. And at present, I'm still heavily involved in PPPs as a member of the Executive Bureau of the United Nations Economics Commission for Europe Working Party on Public-Private Partnerships in Geneva. Now, your PhD is very important as there is a huge gap in English literature on PPPs in China. And this gap really makes transnational dialogue and even participation in projects very difficult. I think your PhD helped to understand how PPPs in China are regulated and structured, and there is also a very interesting comparison with the EU legal framework and the best practices that are identified by the World Bank. Now, let me come to my question. As you might know, the number of PPPs is decreasing. There are no longer PPPs in the United Kingdom, and I think the future for PPPs at the moment, post-COVID, is rather challenging. Many countries are dismantling their PPP units. So my question to you is, what would be the most important issues to regulate to make PPPs future-proof? Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words of my thesis, and thank you very much for your question. if you only allow me to select one most important factor to regulate PPP, I must say the regulation should include the whole life circle of PPP projects. It is really broad. If we want to have a PPP project, it includes project initiation, which the private and public sectors to propose potential projects which can adopt the PPP model, and also the regulation. It also includes the regulation on the project construction and project operation and after contract management of the project. So if I choose this one, I must say it is a very broad one. It requires regulations on the detailed steps. But I think the whole life circle is really important. It makes PPPs different from other cooperations. As in my thesis, I distinguish PPPs from public procurement and concessions, and also the public service purchasing in China. Further, we can also distinguish PPPs from construction projects, a lot of current projects. So I think the whole life circle of PPPs is a distinctive character of PPPs. So if we want to regulate PPP and to make PPP prosper again, we should regulate the whole life circle. And I think, yes, PPP faces a lot of challenges, but after the pandemic, it still has potential to use PPPs, because during the pandemic, the government used a lot of money to fight against the pandemic. After the pandemic, the government should think to use private capital in future, let's say, infrastructure project. And both EU and China have broadened the scope of infrastructure beyond traditional infrastructure, which my thesis touch, water, bridge, and railway. It also touched some new infrastructure like the 5G and also the healthcare. So I still think PPP is a promising cooperation arrangement for the government to use private capital effectively, and also it can increase the provision of public services and works which are essentially important after the pandemic. But yes, it requires the government to increase its governance capacity and legislative capacity on PPPs to think how to use it effectively. Thank you very much.
Are you satisfied with the answer?
Absolutely.
In that case, the opposition will be continued by Professor Melin, who is Assistant Professor of European Law at our university.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, dear Si Tongle, I have not known you during your PhD journey. I just met you a couple of weeks ago. I see the end product, which was a very enjoyable read, thorough analysis of the different legal framework. Thank you very much for this, and also for this very clear presentation. I have a question on your conclusion, but it's also a point that you make now throughout your presentation and during the questions. You mentioned many times that there is no general PPP regulation, neither in China nor in the EU. And you said in your conclusion that the EU and China are exploring whether this is necessary and feasible to have such specific general PPP regulation. Would you consider this as necessary and feasible in the EU and in China?
Thank you. Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words of my thesis, and thank you very much for your question. Yeah, I think it is necessary and, let's say, not exactly possible, but at least it is really necessary to regulate PPPs in both China and the EU. When we talk about necessary and possibility, we should go into deep how to regulate PPPs. It is not only just a release of law, a PPP law, which enjoy very high ranking in the legislative hierarchy. When we regulate it, we have different ways to regulate. Like in China, I still insist we have a administrative regulation, which below the level of law, but above some administrative rules which are specific on PPPs. And in the EU, as I have answered the question to Professor Rubato, and I think it is necessary to have some regulation on PPPs in the EU level, but whether it is possible, as I have mentioned, not possible to have a hard law to unify all regulations of PPPs in the EU, and which also applies to member states. But the EU can also have more explanations of PPPs in soft law, and also pay attention, like what EU is doing, pay attention to important points to regulate PPPs, like the risk allocation, and also maybe in the future, as what I have mentioned in my thesis, to have more evaluation of the effectiveness of these current procurement directives, and maybe in the future they can revise it. But now it is not possible to have a unified PPP regulation in the EU. Hope this answers your question. Thank you very much.
Are you satisfied with the answer?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I am very happy to give the opportunity to Professor van Gerse to raise a second question.
Thank you. I want to continue the discussion on procurement and concessions. You discussed the procurement regime and the concession regime in your PhD. And as we all know, PPPs take a very long time. They have a very long contract term, so there's a long lifespan. And because of this, there are a lot of changes during the PPP contract. For example, because of the war in Ukraine, many PPPs are under pressure, so you need to change things, for example, in relation to energy prices. Do you think Article 72 of the directive, which is the article on changes, is an adequate framework to regulate changes in PPPs? Or do we need a specific regime for changes that is different from public procurement law as we know it nowadays? It's a very technical question, but...
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. I think the Article 72 in the EU directive on the general public procurement, it is about the change when there is something unforeseen happens during the procurement activities. I think this is currently this is adequate to solve the PPP problems. It gives the it regulate under what circumstances the parties can negotiate the items and also change the contract. Yeah, but I think
you may briefly conclude your reply.
I will give it a quick answer. I think now it is adequate, but it's better to have more case to give more explanations of the detailed provisions to see whether we need to change these regulations applied to PPPs.
Tongle Si. The time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And I request that you and your company, both here and online, will await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Tongle Si. The degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taken into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Schneider is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. And I now invite your supervisor to take the floor.
Please, on the rows. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity?
Please use a microphone.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Tongle Si, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. And now we do that.
Dear Dr. Si, dear Tongle, many congratulations with your impressive achievement. Your dissertation significantly contributes to a better understanding of PPPs in China and the EU, and may take the fear away of companies interested in collaborating with public authorities abroad, but which are still hesitating because of the absence of clear PPP regulations. Your research is not just comparing the legislative and regulatory frameworks of PPPs in China and the EU, but does much more. It constructs a theoretical framework to assess whether PPP legal frameworks are effective. This can help target deficiencies in PPP regulation and implementation in many jurisdictions, which can be useful for the creation of future legislation or soft law. Tongle, we are so proud of you, as the topic of your PhD is not an easy one. I was trying to figure out when I received your first email, but my Outlook inbox can only find the last 250 emails that were sent, and then I came to the 14th of July, 2022. Obviously, your work took many, many years of hard work. And when I talked to your PhD colleagues and your paronyms here present today, they all said the same. Tongle is always at the office and works very, very hard. As your supervisors, Hildegard and I know this all too well. You are a go-getter. You are perseverant and never give up. In the first year of your PhD, this became very clear to us when we were constantly debating what the exact topic of your PhD thesis should be. As you repeated many times that you wanted to focus only on the risks of PPPs, while Hildegard and I tried to convince you to look at a broader picture. And when we then received, again, your revised introductory chapter, it was about the risks of PPPs. Even though this is an example of your perseverance, we secretly have to admit that we are happy that your magnificence book now is wider in scope, while at the same time containing very detailed analysis of PPPs, including risks. Tongle, Hildegard, and I are convinced that an extraordinary future lies ahead of you. This is not only because of your legal knowledge, but also, and most importantly, because of who you are, your personality. As just mentioned, Tongle, you never give up. Hildegard and I have provided you with many comments, remarks, and critiques over the years, but you always stayed positive and kept your goal in mind, even though you also had moments of self-doubt and anxiety, which is absolutely normal, by the way. And we admire you for that, Tongle. You are a caring and helpful person, you are attentive and respectful, and you always have a great eye for detail. For example, you immediately noticed that I love earrings. So when you came back from family visits to China, you sometimes surprised us with a souvenir, in my case earrings, and for the record, I do not consider these as a bribe. No corruption there. Tongle, we heard many times from your colleagues, but also from you, how much you love Maastricht. And before you came to Maastricht, you obtained a double master's degree, an LLM in Chinese law from the China University of Political Science and Law, and an LLM in European and International Law from Hamburg University. You completed an optional module in international investment law at the Jagiellonian University, the oldest university in Poland, and you worked as an intern at the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, and in the last phase of your PhD, you went to Stockholm for a research position, which was evaluated very positively by our Swedish colleagues. Now, while being abroad, you always kept Maastricht in your heart. And I hope that this is not only because in Stockholm, Kentucky Fried Chicken was too far away from the city center for you, I heard. So it is clear, Tongle, you did many things over the last few years. You went to many places and you did useful work abroad and even published some of your research in the European Procurement and Public-Private Partnership Law Review. That makes us supervisors very happy. And this effect you have on people seems to be your natural way of being. Indeed, Tongle, your name means happy together. As you may know, this is also the name of a very famous song of the Turtles that was released in 1967 at a time that the band was struggling with personal and financial problems. Even though the song Happy Together was on a first listen rather common, one could tell by the melody line that it was going to be strong. This perfectly fits you and the quality of your work, strong. Tongle, I finish by saying that we now are very happy together. We are happy because of you, we are happy for you, and we are happy together with you. Congratulations, Dr. Si. We wish you a great future ahead.
Dear Dr. Si, also in behalf of Maastricht University and its Faculty of Law, many congratulations on the degree that you just acquired. If I may use the words of Professor Tso, I think the year of the rabbit started very well for you. Congratulations to you, to your family and friends, both present here and present online during this ceremony. Also very good to have had you here with us for this ceremony. And congratulations to your supervisors for also having supervised you as a very good PhD student. I still have one practical remark before I officially close this ceremony. That is that we're going to take the traditional photo of the young doctor together with the paranymphs, the supervisors and the entire committee and the Beadle. And we will do that right here in this aula, so that we also have our two colleagues joining us from outside of Maastricht online, present for that photo. After that, there will be a reception, not in this building, but at another location. If you will not join us for that reception, there is still the opportunity to congratulate, briefly, our young doctor here in this building, in the place that we affectionately call the museum, which is the exhibition space. So with that, I also officially close this academic ceremony.
The supervisors, be very close to the young doctor. Yeah, excellent.